Right, so hi from the Bearded Traveller podcast. This is Tom. I have with me a very special guest today, Duncan Lunan. Now, Duncan is well known for his astronomy work and science fiction writing, but he's also well known for deciphering an alien message and his work on the Green Children of Woolpit, which is a subject we'll come on to in a moment. So, firstly, I want to say hi to Duncan.
Hello, thank you for asking me.
No problem. I didn't realise the depth of your work until I sort of done a little bit of digging. Now, we met through a shared appreciation of the Green Children of Woolpit story, which obviously what I keep saying we'll go on to in a minute. But just for the sakes of our listeners, if we could go back to the beginning, just tell us a little bit about yourself and where you came from.
Well, we're actually in my hometown of Troon, where I grew up. I lived here until I was nearly 30. I was then in Irvine for a while, and then for most of the time, over 30 years, I've been living in Glasgow, but I remarried a couple of years ago, and I'm now back in Troon. What I do is, as you say, I'm a professional writer, and have been since 1970. I'm also a researcher and critic and tutor and editor and broadcaster, and pretty well anything to do with the written and spoken word I've had a shot at it, and one time or another in the intervening years.
Brilliant. Well, it's a few strings there to the many bows. Also, another little story I wanted to just bring you on to. I've read on Wikipedia, I think, about a bit of an early controversy. If I mention a test launch of a nuclear missile, I'm sure you can elaborate on that.
Well, it's quite a long story, so I'll try to tell it briefly. But I did have a quite extraordinary experience when I was 13. It was my first trip away from home, and I travelled from here in Troon to South Uist in the Outer Hebrides, in hopes to see a missile launch from the Royal Artillery Guided Weapons Range. They were, at that time, training the British Army in the use of an American tactical missile called the Firestone Corporal, which was a big piece of kit, liquid-fuelled, 46 feet long. For somebody who was as space mad as I was, it was something I really wanted to see. I went up there, armed with a letter from the commanding officer saying, "Don't come, we won't let you in," and was let in by a guard on the gate who didn't read it. And a chapter of accidents then ensued, in which I did everything I was told, but due essentially to just a catalogue of errors, I ended up being taken to the base of the missile and eventually seeing the launch, courtesy of the commanding officer. And it wasn't until afterwards that the big security flap began, because of course they shouldn't have done any of that. And yes, we had MI5 and the CIA and all sorts of people coming by Troon to interview me and my parents, and it did cause a great flap. But it was an astonishing experience. I saw the last Apollo launch from the VIP area at Cape Canaveral at a distance of 3.5 miles, and some years later I saw a shuttle launch at dawn from a distance of 5 miles. And I am here to tell you that a Firestone Corporal at 400 yards is a far more overwhelming experience. It was getting dark, and the exhaust flame was blinding. It was absolutely dazzling. The thing was well into its climb out before I could see it again. And the noise was, you couldn't hear it. It was just a rattle in the eardrums. And the whole experience was quite stunning. And obviously has remained with me and had a lot to do with the career that I've continued to follow. That, you might say, that was one of my first major adventures in it.
Inspiring stuff. Fantastic. I have to say, I laughed throughout that story.
You've heard all the details about who said what and where they sent me.
Genius. Well, I think that brings us on to now, really. We know you joined the Scottish division of the BIS, the British Interplanetary Society, in 1962, and this led to Astra, which is short for Association in Scotland to Research into Astronauts?
Astronautics.
Astronautics. Yes. And you've been heavily involved in this until 2011, but you stick to not believing in UFOs.
That's a completely different story. I've put a lot of research into contact with extraterrestrial life in all of its aspects, and I simply do not believe we are currently in a contact situation. I can't see any reason in the behaviour of governments to believe that.
I'd agree with that.
Universally accepted, for instance, that the cancellation of the Apollo program was a disaster for the United States, not only in terms of the expertise that it threw away, but in the actual economic impact. Putting 3 million people out of work in 2 weeks was bound to hit the American economy, and they successfully blamed it on the Arabs and the oil price hike, but it had them dumping all those people simultaneously onto welfare had an awful lot more to do with it. And he did that for no other reason than for his hatred of the memory of Kennedy. And in a situation where if it was known to, even if it had been kept from the president, if it was known that they were in a situation where they had to keep pushing ahead with their space program, he simply wouldn't have been allowed to do it. Similarly, if you look at the British case a few years later, just simply compare Margaret Thatcher's reaction to the Falkland Islands. That her immediate response to the Argentine invasion was to send down a task force against very considerable odds, but she was just determined that that situation would not be allowed to continue on her watch. Then we're asked to believe that on being told that British airspace is regularly invaded and people are abducted and subjected to medical experiments and the like without their permission, and that she cancels the British space program and goes and hides under the bed. It isn't credible. I don't see any sign of it at all. And something that I seem to be the only one who's noticed is that the Assange revelations contain nothing about the supposed international conspiracy to conceal
very good point. Very good point there.
Yeah. Nor be it noted any conspiracy to conceal any hopes about the moon landings either. Neither of those is there.
Very, very good point. I mean, as well as that, I mean, and numerous talks that I know you've done around the country. You've also supervised the building of the first astronomically aligned stone circle in Britain in 300 years, as far as we know.
3,000.
3,000. And this is Sight-hill Park, which is where we were today. Did you want to tell us a little bit about the project?
Certainly. It was a jobs creation project. It was part of that window dressing that was done at the end of the 70s to try to counter the successful SNP campaign about the oil revenues, and to try to make it look as if the oil revenues were being put back into Scotland. It was simply window dressing, but with this particular project, within that context, in fact, the money that was allocated to Glasgow was well used to fit the requirements of the jobs creation programme. As it happened, the Parks Department was ideally suited, and they did put the money to a lot of very useful purposes. And one of the things was that they had to have special projects. They got a chap from Northern Ireland who was very good at this sort of thing to give them a list of special projects, one of which was astronomy, about which he knew nothing. So he held a schools competition, and the winning entry was to build a copy of Stonehenge or Callanish in modern materials. They eventually approached me through the late Professor Archie Roy at Glasgow University and asked if I would do it. My first task was to convince them that a copy of an ancient site would not work in the present-day Glasgow, because the latitude would be wrong, the skyline would be wrong, the tilt of the Earth's axis has altered half a degree, precession of the equinoxes has moved the positions of the stars that are incorporated into Callanish. It just simply wouldn't work. I would have to find a suitable site and design a monument according to the ancient principles. Having established that, my second line of attack was to get rid of the modern materials and say that we should build it in stone and dedicate it to Professor Alexander Thom, Dr. Archie Thom, Dr. Ewan Mackay, and Dr. Roy, as he then was, all of them past or present staff members at Glasgow University, all major experts in the field of ancient astronomy, and all closely connected with the city. And that too was agreed to, and then I had the green light to do what I actually did. I found, with the help of the late John Braithwaite, who joined me, we found, having found the site, we scoured the quarries of the west of Scotland and eventually found the last black powder quarry, which was the source of the stones, and they were brought into Glasgow, and in due course the big ones erected to mark the lunar alignments on the advice of Professor Thom, and then the remaining stones were brought in by the sunstones and the starstones were brought in by Royal Navy helicopter, and working sunwise round the circle from the midsummer sunrise position. The circle was phase one of the circle was completed, and as you say, as far as we know, it was the first. But when I started saying it's the first of its kind for 3,500 years, I was trailing my coat to see if anyone would stamp on it, and nobody did. Nobody has ever challenged that claim or come forward with a conflicting example, so I believe it to be true.
Brilliant. Well, we'll come back to the stone circle bit a bit later, because we've got a little bit of an appeal to make, I guess. But, I mean, you mentioned about Alexander Thom. I know a little bit about Alexander Thom, and from what I gather, he'd done a lot of work, a lot of surveying work, a lot of hard, painstaking work at lots of megalithic sites around England. Really good stuff. But I mean, do you want to tell us about him? He's your hero, essentially.
Well, he's one of my heroes, but he's one of the very few people I've met to whom I would accord the name of genius. And a quite extraordinary personality, very forceful personality, but a man of extraordinary insights. He was a keen yachtsman among his many facets, and in his youth, or comparative youth, moored off the island of Lewis, he saw from offshore the moon rise over Callanish, and as an engineer, reckoned that what he could see in the way of the alignment of the stones relative to the moonrise could not be coincidental, and he began to devote his life to that. As an adjunct to his professional career, he was the first reader in aeronautics at Glasgow University, and eventually ended up teaching applied mathematics at Oxford, and was very talented in these fields. But what undoubtedly he is most remembered for is the extraordinary body of work that he did on ancient sites in Britain and Brittany. And as you say, surveying, even for his first book, surveying hundreds of sites. And the work that he did in Brittany with his son, Dr. Archie Thom, in terms of man-hours, was the largest archaeological project of the 20th century. It was the body of work was absolutely staggering, and I am firmly convinced, having gone into it in a lot of depth, that he was by and large right, particularly about the astronomy. On the island of Colonsay, his studies had been interrupted by bad weather. His yacht's anchor had begun to drag, and he had to put off, and he never got back there. So I went and did a very rough survey of my own, without having seen any of his preliminary sketches, which turned out to be far more meticulous than what I did. But what I found, just starting with the Ordnance Survey map and following the lie of the land, was that at the first 5 sites I checked, just taking very rough bearings with a compass and clinometer, when I got home, and worked up the results, every one of them had a significant astronomical alignment, which is not something you could possibly argue was chance. A friend of mine, Tony Crerar, has devoted a large part of his life to studying alignments in Powys in Wales, where Thom never went. So he's looking at completely virgin sites in that sense. And he too has found a very comprehensive range of astronomical alignments. I don't think there's any doubt, really, to my mind, on the astronomical front that Thom was quite right in what he said.
I quite agree. And he was obviously the first to identify, rediscover, if you like, the megalithic yard. Is that right?
Well, that was his own interpretation of his results. He concluded that the builders of the megalithic sites, both in Britain and Brittany, were using a standard unit of length, which was so standard that there must have been a standard rule somewhere from which it was cut, possibly the shadow of a favoured stone, for instance, some particularly significant site. There's lots of things that it could relate to. Statistically, as I understand it from the late John Braithwaite, who worked with me on the project, knew a lot more about statistics than I did. Again, Thom's arguments are beyond reproach. There was a standard unit of length. And the archaeological attacks on Thom, which were going on big time when I became involved in this, all focused on the idea that Neolithic society simply did not have the level of social organisation to conduct on an ongoing programme of observational research, which is what Thom deduced from his findings, much less to have an astronomer priesthood who would have a ritual measuring. Each priest would have his measuring rod, presumably. Well, it turns out from recent discoveries at Stonehenge and Durrington Walls, at Kilmartin, and particularly on the Brodgar Peninsula in Orkney, that there actually was not just a nationwide but a Europe-wide Neolithic culture with a priesthood and a much higher level of social organisation than the archaeologists back then in the late 70s and 80s would accept. It is now known for a fact that this culture did exist, as Dr. Ewan Mackay, who was one of the few archaeologists to back Thom, had argued that it was in some respects comparable to the society of the ancient Maya. All of this is now pretty well vindicated. And one of the points I've made in my book, having started with the controversy as it was when I came to it and gone on through the story of my own involvement in it, one of the things that I find, well, I wish I didn't find it surprising, but the truly remarkable thing is that certain prominent figures, whom I won't embarrass by naming, have done television series, books and public lectures within the last couple of years saying everything except the words Thom and Mackay were right. though they are in fact endorsing what Thom and Mackay said in every particular.
Brilliant. That's brilliant. Fantastic. Excellent. Well, I think that's cleared that one up then. So we've obviously written many books. Now, the one that I want to focus on today, and I apologise for focusing on one and not giving the others enough time, really. But obviously we met through basically what I consider to be a true X-File. I'll let you speak about it in a second, but the Green Children of Woolpit, a very strange tale from Suffolk, which is near where I grew up, and I came across the story whilst dowsing. I think Graham Gardner, the president of the BSD, British Society of Dowsers, kindly put us in contact. But it's a real tale, and it's probably going to stay with me till I tell the grandkids and everything else. But you've obviously done a lot of work on it, looking at the historical facts, and you've created a very, very good book that I would recommend to anyone, really. But do you want to just tell us a little bit about the story of the Green Children?
Certainly. Yes, I'm grateful to Graham, who's an old friend for putting us in touch. The story, in essence, is that in the 12th century, date I think I have pinned down to 1173, but two different chronicles record that two very strange children came out of an ancient earthwork in Suffolk at the village of Woolpit, which is about 8 miles east of Bury St Edmunds. The remarkable thing is that although Woolpit was an aspiring market town on what was then the major pilgrim route in England from Ipswich to Bury St Edmunds, the children spoke a language nobody recognised, wore clothing of a colour and material never seen before, unquote, and were coloured green all over. Now, initially they seem to have been quite roughly treated. They were put on public show, and they weren't fed until they showed signs of distress, at which point they were offered food and wouldn't take it. And they were then conducted to the home of a knight called Richard de Calna. Not Sir Richard de Calna. The title Sir for knights didn't come in for another couple of 100 years. But de Calna is very difficult to trace. Most people have just jumped to conclusions about him. But in fact, he was a man of great of consequence. I'll tell you more about him in a moment. But the crucial thing in the mystery is that when they had learned our manner of speaking, it seemed to the wise that they might be christened, and even that was done. At that point, the narrative in both chronicles was written quite separately at opposite ends of the country, and from very different viewpoints. One interviewing witnesses to the children's arrival, the other getting the story from de Calna when the girl who survived was grown up. But the account goes into formal terminology at this point in both chronicles, and what other translators have been rendering as she said or they said is actually gave evidence or swore on oath. And I discovered that from a friend who has a diploma in theology from the College of Cardinals, that even today a christening in controversial circumstances must be preceded by an inquisitio, which is a formal hearing conducted by a bishop. Any reader, almost certainly with either a clerical background or at least a clerical education, any reader of the Chronicles at the time would have known that and would have recognised a lot of other things within the narrative that give it verisimilitude. It all fits, and the more you go into it, the better it fits. But they were asked who and from whence they were, and are said to have replied, "We are people of the land of St. Martin." Now, the land of St. Martin, it's not where they were from. It's to do with who they were. The land of St. Martin was the Essex property of the Church of St. Martin's le Grand, which was the principal sanctuary in England, standing next to St. Paul's and under the control of the Bishop of London, who was also the superior of Coggeshall Abbey, where one of the two chronicle accounts was written down. Again, anyone reading this would have got it at the time and said, it's the Bishop of London who's in charge here. So he asked them, where are they from? He's done that bit. And pretending not to know what the land of St. Martin is, he says, do they believe in our Saviour there? To which the reply is, yes, you can't see the place for churches, which is, I think, a story they've been told to tell. And they're very nearly home free at this point. The only remaining question is, does the sun rise or set there? Because it was believed there was no sun in fairyland. All they had to say was yes, but they couldn't bring themselves to lie. And instead described an upbringing on a planet which has a human settlement on it, but it's not Earth. It was they were in a country of permanent twilight, separated by a broad river from a country of permanent daylight. Apparently, they're living on the terminator of a planet with a trapped rotation, keeping the same face always towards its star. Robert Burton recognised that and put the story in as a throwaway reference in the astronomy section of the Anatomy of Melancholy, which was published in 1621, which is where I found it as a student. So I had always wanted to do something with it. And in 1993, I was covering a conference at the British National Space Centre for the Glasgow Herald, and decided to go up to East Anglia from London. And I went armed with a set of questions, which I'd worked out with a historian friend, not expecting to get anything but some local colour. But as I went around Woolpit, where I was made very welcome, the National Geographic documentary notwithstanding, I was made very welcome. But people kept saying, for that, you'd have to go to the County Records Office. So I did. And 5 hours in the County Records Office convinced me that I was onto something, because I was finding answers to the questions. Coming back to Decalna, I found enough to realise that the standard reading of that he was the Lord of the Manor, and a man of little consequence because he doesn't feature in the record. Perhaps a masterless knight with a horse and a sword. Not a bit of it. The reason Decalna is so hard to trace is that at the end of the civil war between Stephen and Matilda, he was excused all taxes in perpetuity because of his outstanding service to the new King Henry II. So he remains off the record for the rest of his life. He's M. He's the head of the Secret Service. And it's to him that the villagers take the children, crossing the land of two barons to get there. Decalna was very highly connected. His father was the Bishop of Ely, and had before that been Treasurer of England. His half-brother became Treasurer and Bishop of London. His cousin was Archdeacon of Lincoln and subsequently Bishop. His uncle was the Bishop of Norwich. His great-uncle was Regent of England under Henry I and Bishop of Salisbury. The first mystery is why, as a younger son of a family of churchmen, how did he earn his spurs in the first place? And the answer, almost certainly, is that he enlisted in the Second Crusade under Richard de Hastings, who was his next-door neighbour in Suffolk, and was the English master of the Knights Templar. And I must admit, when I found the Templar connection, my heart sank. Not the Templars again. But then the Templars were so actively involved in everything that was going on that if there was anything going on, they would be a part of it. They'd have someone on the inside. And yeah, in fact, when you start digging, the circumstantial evidence strongly implies that Decalna was an associate Templar, a married brother, and that he'd been in the Second Crusade with De Hastings, and that was how he'd achieved this. But he and De Hastings were still like that. They each had a knight living on the other's land in service to them. So the constant two-way communication, and from there straight to the king, who very definitely was keeping a very close eye on what was going on. It turns out that they were expecting something to happen in Woolpit. Henry had already annexed the village from Bury St Edmunds Abbey, and supposedly refused 2 commands from the Pope to give it back. But when you look at the actual letter from the Pope, which survives and is addressed to the Abbot of Bury St Edmunds, what it says is, concerning the church of St Mary Woolpit and the village that went with it, we have ordered the king to return it to you when he has finished with it. Which is quite a different matter. Supposedly, Henry had annexed the village because he had a poor clerk who needed the income of £10 a year. The poor clerk, in quotes, turns out to be the Deputy Chancellor of England, who was the richest man in the country. A man who would in those days, think nothing of spending £10,000 on a single banquet. He was not stuck for a tenner. And it goes on like that. The major thing, I think, is that in 1173, in the middle of the biggest war of his reign, when his sons and his queen had rebelled against him in alliance with the Scots and the French and the Flemish, Henry suddenly breaks off from the defence of Normandy, dashes back across the Channel, disappears into East Anglia, puts a garrison of crack troops, who are almost certainly Templars from clues in the narrative, into the castle next to Woolpit, and dashes back to the fighting. And I very strongly think, from circumstantial evidence that ties in with it, that it was the arrival of the children that triggered that. And as it happened, changed the outcome of the war, because the presence of that crack garrison in Hagnett Castle made the difference when the Earl of Leicester invaded England at the head of a Flemish army. He detoured to take out that garrison, which surrendered to him as a unit, very unusually for the time. And that delay allowed the English armies to muster and defeat Leicester and his Flemish troops in the field. And from there, everything just turned Henry's way, and the rebellion went down like a stack of dominoes. So it probably seemed to him that the children had been sent by God to save his kingdom.
Well, yeah.
Which explains why he puts the Bishop of London, who'd supported him throughout, in charge of the case. And everything else just continues to fall into place. And the more you dig into the story, the more it clicks, and the more convincing it becomes.
Fantastic. Now, on first hearing about the tale, my first instinct was the skeptical instinct, and I immediately tried to look for evidence of a hoax, evidence of, I don't know, an explanation that was tangible and didn't involve possibly extraterrestrials, or but in all honesty, the conclusion I reached was that the most likely explanation was that they were either extraterrestrial or some sort of genetic split from us species from an earlier time, which would obviously still make them extraterrestrial in any case. But I think some of the hoaxes around the green skin were in reference to arsenic poisoning. There's a few of those, isn't there? But I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, I did go into the medical thing at length and couldn't find anything. There was, for instance, a lot has been made of a condition called chlorosis, which supposedly turns young women green.
Yeah.
Wouldn't explain the boy.
No.
But in fact, it turns out that chlorosis was an early 19th century phenomenon. It's associated with the birth of the Industrial Revolution. It happened to young women in towns in stressful situations, and was in fact a disease that never existed. Nobody had a patient who turned green. They all knew somebody who had a patient in another city. Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, it's it's also known as the Virgin's disease. The greenness is symbolic. It appears in modern textbooks under the headings of diseases that never were. The only thing that turns people green that I've been able to find is acute retention of bile products, in which case it's a sign of imminent death. Clearly was not the case with the children who survived what must have been quite an ordeal at the beginning, because even when they went to Decalna's place for a considerable period, they wouldn't eat. And they're described in the Chronicles as nearly starving to death. They had a very strong taboo against eating anything they didn't recognise. And that comes out clearly in both Chronicles. But the girl said, in so many words, that all the people in the land that she came from were dyed with the same green colour. And that's the obvious explanation, that it's a permanent vegetable dye. Probably some form of camouflage, I suspect, or protective coloration, because I am still going with accepting the apparent literal truth of the story, that this was a human settlement on another world where there was non-terrestrial life, hence the very strong taboo about not eating anything you don't recognise. But yet, the girl was unquestionably human. She grew up, she married, she had 2 children, whose descendants I have traced to the present, and one of them was deputy leader under Thatcher. He was deputy leader of the House of Lords, and he thinks it's an absolute hoot. He told the Glasgow Evening Times, "I knew my ancestors were colourful, but not that colourful."
The colour green one would,
quite. And it is, there's no question about it. This is the X-Files. This is apparently abduction of a significant number of people from Earth for experimental purposes, with the knowledge, if not the active connivance, of some at least of the terrestrial authorities. It's the X-Files in the 12th century, as you said earlier.
It seems to be the rational conclusion from this. However irrational it would seem to the listeners, in just the digging I've done in the short space around reading the book, The Children of the Sky, it is quite compelling, very compelling stuff, really. But one thing as well that I did like in the book, I better just explain quickly the format. Well, perhaps you could explain the format of the book. It'd probably be better.
Essentially, it's divided into 3 sections. The first is setting the historical background, because in order to understand the evidence when I come to it, you really do need to know the history of England from the Norman Conquest onwards, and particularly the history of the Knights Templar, and at least a bit about what was going on in the Holy Land through the 12th century, and so I've done that, and I've then introduced a couple of previous episodes that appear to be related to the story, and then a chapter entitled Green Children and Red Herrings, in which I have looked at the various other explanations people have come forward with, and tried to, and investigated them, and at the end of it concluded that we really are still left with the idea that there was something much bigger going on. Whatever it was, something much bigger was going on. And so then part 2 of the book essentially tells the story of the Green Children, and particularly of the Green Girl, whom I believe I have identified as Agnes, the wife of Richard Barr, who was one of Henry's senior ambassadors. And if she is who I think she is, the mere fact that she would marry somebody like that, apparently Richard de Calna's godson, certainly his protege, who was in exactly the right place at the right time when you research the history of his own life, and they jointly, with de Calna's granddaughter, inherited family property, which was probably assigned by the king. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that puts Agnes in the frame. I think she's the girl, and I followed the story of her life through to her death in 1238. Visited on her deathbed by Henry III, it would seem, and then traced her descendants down to the present, and meanwhile noted a few more strange episodes over the next 100 years or so. And then in part 3 of the book, which I have forthrightly entitled Speculation, I've gone into the whole possible underlying scenario, and I have done what science fiction writers call world building, in which I've tried to guess as much as we could about the planet and the technology being used. And it's amazing how much you can you can put together from the few clues we have.
It is. It reminded me a bit of when I was a bit younger, and I read a book on how scientifically a lightsaber from Star Wars could be construed, and it is kind of it's science fiction based on scientific principle and perhaps quantum theory and other bits and pieces. But it's a great read, fantastic read. As I say, I falsely say it's the second half of the book, but the back part of the book is a science fiction blast of ideas based on the historic account. It's just brilliant. And the other thing is that
but I should emphasise, not telling it as fiction. It's still discussing the speculative possibilities. I was constantly urged in the years when I was looking for a publisher to tell it as fiction, to make it a novel, even to make it another Da Vinci Code. But there is no point in doing that, because who will believe the research if they can't tell what I made up from what is factual? So I haven't made anything up in that sense. In part 3, when I've clearly labelled it as speculation, I'm saying, well, what if it is true? But it isn't fiction. It's in that sense. It's a discussion of what does it all mean, Professor?
Yeah. The other bit that I noted as well was some bits in there. We spoke briefly about the Knights Templar, but we've got a story about the Knights Templar, amongst other stories, appearing in a church.
Well, this was a jaw dropper. I had no anticipation of this at all, but when I went back to East Anglia, having realised that I was on to something, I went to Coggeshall Abbey, where Ralph of Coggeshall wrote down his account of the children, which he got personally from De Calna. And one of the bits that survives is the barn, which is preserved by the National Trust, and the curator very kindly opened it up, and we were talking about the story, and he said, "I've found something just very recently that's been handed in to me, which it's a typescript. It's actually a carbon copy of a piece that was written under a pen name by a member of the local historical society, and you might find it of interest." So he brought it to me, and sitting in the doorway reading it with the sun, by the light of the sun streaming in, I suddenly found myself reading this quite astonishing account of how, as it turns out, between 1175 and 1179, or even 1178, you can pin it down that narrowly, a bunch of Knights Templar materialised within the guest house of the Abbey, without coming in through the gates or any other route, and it's you're dealing with very marshy ground. There's no possibility of tunnels or anything like that. They were discovered by chance by the brother who was in charge of the guest house on his way to dinner, and immediately sent him off on a fool's errand to see the abbot about getting dinner for them. But very interestingly, in the conversation that they had, the leader of the party revealed himself to be a Templar master. He actually quoted the rule which said that the Templar masters should not eat in private, but in hall with the other brethren. And whoever these guys were, they appear to have been high-ranking Templars, or at least led by high-ranking Templars. When Brother Robert got back to the guest house, having informed the abbot of what was happening, they'd gone, and he raised the alarm, and it was discovered that they had been seen on the other side of the church. The guest house is on the extreme south end of the church. They had been seen at the north end of the church, rushing towards the cemetery. And there doesn't seem to be any way to get there without crossing the intervening space without being seen. There's only one way through the abbey, and that was occupied by the knights by the monks having dinner. If they had gone round on the west, they would have been seen from the gatehouse, and on the right, access was blocked by the river. They appear to have beamed in, beamed over, and beamed out again. And the most likely thing, in context, is that they were after the body of the boy. If he had been buried in the grounds of the abbey, if he had died shortly after his christening, which clearly was held nearby, it's quite possible that the Bishop of London might have used his authority to have him buried in the Brothers' Cemetery, which otherwise would not be permitted because children weren't admitted to Cistercian grounds. But in this case, maybe they made an exception, and maybe the Templars decided they had to get him back for whatever reason. But I think this is. It looks like what we're. Yeah, that this is part of the story is very strongly my suspicion. It's notable that because of the cemetery connection, modern writers jumped to the conclusion they were ghosts, but nobody who was there at the time thought they were ghosts. The big concern was, what were these Garn men doing inside the abbey, and what harm might they do? That was the reason why a hue and cry was raised. Nobody thought they were ghosts. So there we have it. It's one more strand in the puzzle.
Excellent. That's creepy stuff. So, I mean, the actual Children of the Sky, the Green Children sort of project, if you like, I mean, how long did it take for you to... I mean, it's obviously not completed at the moment, but to date...
I spent 10 years on it, more or less full time. I was writing other things in the meantime, but it was my major project for 10 years. And in the meantime, of course, I was trying to find a publisher. I did get the article done, and it appeared in Analog in 1996. But it didn't lead to interest from publishers or even from agents. And it has taken, in all, 18 and a half years to get the book into print. For quite a chunk of that time, in the last 5 or 6 years, I have been running a major educational project centred on Airdrie Observatory, so I haven't done that much with it in that time. But there certainly are more strands to the inquiry. There are manuscripts in the British Library that remain to be examined, for instance, and there may well be a lot more to do. So while what we've got is complete in itself, I do intend to go back to this and do more.
So maybe a sequel on the horizon.
Yes, indeed. I mean, one aspect I am always asked about is there any possibility of time travel involved in this? To which the answer is perhaps. But to produce this book in a form suitable for publication, I had to take some stuff out, and I dropped the time travel as an alternative explanation. If you start considering the idea that the events might have happened in a different order as far as the participants are concerned, it gets unbelievably complicated. So, Children from the Future maybe in the pipeline at some stage, but even without that, there are many other angles to pursue.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm sort of trying to work on a science fiction sort of screenplay at the moment, but just some of the ideas that you bring forward in the latter part of the book around the colony and how this race could exist in that environment is very inspiring stuff, and it it's brilliant. And there is, as you say, there is lots of avenues to go down. But the beauty with this is it's a research driven project. It's not purely creative. It's driven by the research.
Going back to your earlier question about UFOs, one of the things about it and other inquiries of this type that particularly fascinates me is that there are angles that you can pursue. I've talked to an awful lot of people over the years who have seen a light in the sky that they couldn't identify. And even if they can give you an account of when and where it was, which most people can't, you're still left saying, well, I don't know what that was. And there's nothing more to do.
Yeah.
You've conducted the interview and the story's over. This is so much bigger, as my friend... There are two quotes from my late friend John Braithwaite, which I've put into it. When I'd been on it 6 months, he said to me, if somebody makes up a story like this, they tend to make it up out of whole cloth. They invent a story and then put a few real names in it to make it look convincing. But you check up and you find that people couldn't have been in those places at those times, and it falls apart. You know, even at that point, when I'd been on it for 6 months, he said no fictitious story would stand up to the kind of scrutiny you're giving it. And his other great line was, even if it's not extraterrestrial contact, you've got the political thriller of all time. Because it is beyond question that something big was going on, with some very high-ranking people involved in it. And the king definitely wanting a piece of the action, as it seems. And the Pope at least aware that something was happening, that and warning people not to interfere. So it's big.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, that's probably enough about the Green Children of Woolpit. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about the book, plug it.
Certainly. Well, the book is Children from the Sky, published by Mutas Liber, my good friend Sean Martin in Edinburgh. It is available through Amazon, Waterson's, W.H. Smith's, and all good bookshops. It costs £15 odd, under £16. It's illustrated by Sidney Jordan, who was the artist who created Jeff and drew Jeff Hawke, the world's longest-running science fiction cartoon. A big name in graphics art, especially, funnily enough, in Europe, much more so than here. And it's, in spite of his very long and varied career, it's the first book that he's illustrated. So it's worth it for that, the artwork alone. There's an awful lot of work in it, and feedback is definitely welcomed.
Brilliant.
So that's that one. And then, of course, the next book is the book about the Stone Circle, which also came out last year. It's called The Stones and the Stars. It's been produced internationally by Springer, so they've gone for a fairly neutral title of that, but it's subtitled Building Scotland's Newest Megalith. Yeah. That one is £19 odd, and that's available Amazon, Waterson's, W.H. Smith's, Sainsbury's, and Love Reading as well. And it is on sale all over the world. There are chains in New Zealand carrying it, and it has turned out to be very topical. It covers the story of the Stone Circle from the start of the project in 1978 up to the middle of last year. Just after the book was published in November of 2012, my wife and I were summoned to a meeting with Development and Regeneration Services of Glasgow City Council, and we were told that the entire site is to be wiped, not just the circle, but the whole park that it stands in are to be destroyed, on the possibility that Glasgow may become host city to the 2018 Youth Olympics. They want to show the Olympics Committee a site stripped, ready for the Olympic Village. And, we were told more or less in tones of contempt that the circle was of no value, no interest to anyone, and must go without further delay. We have succeeded in the last 3 months in convincing the council officials that the circle is of value and that a lot of people care about it, but they are still not committing to preserving it or replacing it when the clearance of the ground has been done. And that is what we now need to focus on, because we've probably only got a month. The petition now has over 3,400 signatures and can be found on the website www.sight-hill-stone-circle.net. And there are also at least 600 people on another petition on Facebook. And signatures are coming not just from the Sight-hill area in Glasgow where it stands, but from the whole city, nationwide and indeed worldwide. It's arousing a great deal of concern. It turns out that, among others, the Druid and pagan communities have been quite on the quiet, using it for their own purposes, and very much wish it to be preserved. So all of that is, at the moment, my biggest concern, and all support would be welcome. So how to support it is all there on the website, www.sight-hill-stone-circle.net. That's where to get it.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for that. I just want to reinforce that and say I've been to the circle today, only briefly, but it's a really nice site, and it'll be a real shame to lose it, really. As I say, it's one of the few bits of green terrain that are left in Glasgow, and it'll be a shame to ruin that, even, to put some, silly little bits of greenery back in. But it's a bit of a shame, but, hopefully we'll be able to turn that around, and people will be able to continue to use the site for what it is. Fantastic. Is there anything else you want to add, Duncan?
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground and my voice is giving out, so it's probably a good time to wrap it up.
Fantastic. Well, thanks ever so much for speaking to us. And thanks ever so much, listeners. This is The Bearded Traveller. We'll speak to you soon. Okay, bye.